What's up guys? Today we have a fun video. So we have this Switch V2 board here, and you can see there's a few chips taken off of it. This was a customer who brought their Switch in, and the Switch had been bent pretty drastically on the frame. The board itself is slightly bent here, but this is enough to cause pretty massive issues with the console, especially under these BGA chips, where the solder pads under the APU and the RAM, and also on the chips themselves, can rip off. And you can see that is exactly what happened in this case. If I go under the microscope, you can see a ton of ripped pads just right there on the bottom right corner, all in the same sort of area. So you can see that's sort of where the bend impacted the APU, and then a few ripped pads on these as well. So not only this, but we also have ripped traces underneath the actual APU in the same corner. You can see some damage. So this is the kind of job where fixing this is absolutely not worth the price of the console. You could get Switch V1, V2s these days for like $100, and I would have to charge quite a bit of money to do this kind of repair. Not to mention that you would normally only do this kind of repair for something like data recovery, because it's not ever going to be a super reliable repair, especially with the ripped traces on the APU itself. So I've gone ahead and bought this board from the customer for the purposes of using it as a donor board. I've only actually pulled off these two MAX chips before to use on a different console. So even though there's absolutely zero reason to attempt fixing this, I'm going to do it anyways for fun. I always like to have some sort of challenging project for myself on the side outside of actual customer repairs that stretches my capabilities and my knowledge. And this is the perfect candidate for a completely unrealistic repair that will be fun to try out with you guys and see if we can't get this board working again. So the first step is going to be to reball these two max power regulator chips. The larger of the two chips is for the main power regulator on the board, which goes right here, and then the other one goes right here. Both of these generate a few voltage rails that power on at various stages of the boot sequence. This one in particular powers on at the second stage. So the first step is going to be to take these two max chips and reball them. So let's get going with that. I realized that I forgot to put board holders in my tool video, but this is the one I use. I really like this thing. It's super nice for holding small boards like the Switch motherboard. These things move around like this and they're spring loaded. So you would normally put a straight side of the board if there is one on this side, and then any sort of differences in the board shape on the other side so that they can be accounted for with these spring loaded things. But what I really like this board holder for is holding small ICs like this. If they're a square, you can either put them in the corners like this, or you can put it in the straight part like this. And this is super nice for holding a BGA chip or a QFN package or a MOSFET or something while you're just cleaning it up or tinning it. One thing I'll mention if you're using a board holder like this is to not tighten it too much, especially because you're going to be applying heat to the chip. You don't want to crack the chip or bend the chip. So only tighten this enough for it to hold it in place and leave it at that. All right, so now that we have the chip secured down, let's get under the microscope here and apply some flux to the chip. That's plenty. So I'm just going to set my knife tip at 375 and put a bunch of leaded solder on my iron. You can be very generous with a big blob like this, and then just touch all of these pads and mix in leaded solder with it. You can see that worked great. And after this, you'll have a massive blob of solder on your iron. So just make sure you carefully move your iron over to clean your tip, or else you're going to throw molten solder everywhere. All right, and I'm going to boost my iron temp to about 425. With the smaller C210 tips like this that I'm using, I find that you have to use a higher temperature than you normally would when you're wicking, because the heat transfer on those small tips can be a little bit subpar, to say the least. The other thing to note when you're wicking is it's best to tin your iron just a tiny bit, just like this, before you wick, and that way you actually transfer heat better to the wick itself. And definitely use flux with the wick as well. So we're just going to go over these pads gently. And you don't want to scrape these, especially these particular ICs are pretty delicate, so don't scrape it with your iron or push down all that much with the wick. Just be patient and go over it a couple times. So we're going to try to go over this area here and that corner up there. That's perfect. I'll use some low temperature hot air to just melt the flux a bit, and then we can mop it up with the Kim wipe. And that's looking pretty good to me. There's a little bit of extra solder on a few of those pads, but it's a small enough amount that it's not going to be causing any problems for us. And we're going to take this out of here. And there's going to be some flux underneath the chip. I actually like to keep that there and not clean the chip, just so it doesn't move around when we move it to the Kim wipe. So we're going to take a brand new Kim wipe or a paper towel or something like that. Just place the chip on the Kim wipe like this, and I'll just gently press down on the chip so the flux sort of adheres the chip to the Kim wipe a bit. So that's perfect. And I'm going to hold the chip while I just clean the top of it with a Q-tip. I just want to kind of dry it off a bit, and then I'll press down again. All right, so I have a stencil that is for a lot of the switch chips. This is for the memory, and then these two are for the max chips here. So I believe this is the one we're looking for. So we can just line up the stencil quickly to make sure that's the correct one. And it is. You can see it fits perfectly. So before I do anything with this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a little bit of this solder paste with this type of tool here, and that is more than enough. So I'm actually just going to take a tiny bit of this off, and we'll just go with this much. And before we actually use this, I'm going to take a Kim wipe like this and just dab the flux off of the solder paste. And the reason I'm doing this is because if there's too much flux in the solder paste that you use for reballing, it's going to overflow into the various holes of the stencil. And when you try to heat the solder paste to create the balls, the overflowing flux will make some of those balls connect to each other, especially since they're so close together on this chip. It causes all sorts of issues for you. So you just want to dab it on a paper towel or Kim wipe like this just to make it a bit more dry. You can see the difference between this and the stuff that's in here, which has a lot more flux in it. So we're going to go back underneath the microscope, and what I'm going to do is line up our stencil here, and I'm going to press down with my fingers on both sides of the chip. This is very important. So you want to keep your fingers here during this whole process. I'm going to do it actually on diagonal like this. You really want to keep your fingers on the stencil, keep the pressure down the whole time you're doing this. If you lift the pressure up at any point between now and the time that you melt the solder balls, what's going to happen is the solder paste is going to get underneath the stencil, and we don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over the stencil sort of in a flat way like this, and you're not putting too much pressure down, just enough to get the solder paste to go in the holes, and then we can scrape it away like this. And then we're going to go one more time, same exact thing, just put the solder paste down and go over the stencil, and then we're going to scrape it up again and remove the excess. Again, this whole time we're keeping pressure with our fingers. Next thing we're going to do is take our finger and just wipe over the top, and you just want to get all the excess off and dry off the top of the stencil just like this. This is perfect. You can see I have my left hand holding the stencil down, and I'm going to use these tweezers. Definitely grab this shape. This shape is incredible for this kind of work, and just put it right over the chip. I'm actually just probably going to cover up the chip a little bit because this one's small, and I want to make sure the pressure is directly on the chip like this. So we're going to go back to the microscope, and I'm going to do that. making sure to not remove the pressure from the chip, and press down. And I'm removing the pressure from my fingers, and I'm going to do very, very low airspeed, 15-20% airspeed, and we're going to go for about 300 degrees Celsius. Before I even put the hot air on the stencil, just letting it get up to temperature, and we're just going to slowly bring in the hot air. So I'm not directly putting the hot air currently on the stencil, it's just sort of farther away from it, and we're going to come in closer and closer to the stencil, and we'll start to see the solder balls get created. And then we're going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Remove the heat. And we're going to count to 3 again. 1, 2, 3. And then we can remove the chip from the stencil. So we're just going to sort of poke it out of the stencil here. And we have our reballed chip. Simple as that. And the last thing we're going to want to do before it's finished, hold it with your tweezers and pop a little bit of flux on top. Just like this. And we want to reflow all of these. So I'm going to turn up the airspeed, and we're just going to hit this one more time. And that's plenty right there. You saw all of those solder balls just remelted and sort of centered themselves. That's exactly what we're looking for. Look how nice this chip looks. Good stuff. So the most important things to get a nice reball with a direct heated stencil along with the solder paste is, number 1, dry the solder paste. Definitely dry the solder paste. Don't skip that step. You will have all kinds of problems with the balls connecting to each other and stuff like that. Number 2, constant pressure on the stencil towards the chip. Never release pressure. If you release pressure once with your fingers, you might as well just restart and clean all the solder paste out of the stencil while you still can, because you're going to have a mess on your hands. So constant pressure with your fingers, and then constant pressure on the chip with your tweezers while you heat the stencil. And number 3, I would say, is get yourself a pair of tweezers like this. It's going to make your life so much easier when you're doing this kind of reballing, because you have this nice flat surface here on the tweezers and this really great angle where you can very easily apply even pressure to the stencil and ensure that no solder paste gets underneath the chip while you are applying heat. So I'll have a link to these tweezers in the description if you're interested. But these things are super great when you are reballing chips with solder paste like this. So we'll do the exact same thing with the other power regulator chip. This one is the smaller one, and it's the second stage. And this one's already cleaned up, so I am going to put some flux on the back of it on purpose here, just to help stick it to the Kim wipe a little bit better. Perfect. And that's just going to help keep that steady, but I will dry the top of the chip. So here are our 2 chips we just reballed. They look great. I don't recommend trying to reball these with a jig and balls. I've done it before. That is not fun and takes quite a long time. I think they're the smallest solder ball size that I own, and these chips are like tiny. Here's my pinky. Both chips combined are smaller than the size of my pinky nail. So yeah, these are not fun to try to reball with solder balls. Do yourself a favor and buy this like $2 stencil or however much it is. All right, so next I'm gonna pop this switchboard in the board holder here. This little dip ends up being perfect for the switch console to fit the USB-C port there. All right, so here is the area of the board that we're looking to clean and put the chip back on. And again, I'm just going to combine leaded solder with these. So I'm just going to use some flux, tin my iron a ton with leaded solder, and just go over all of these. So you can see this is what happens if you use an iron that isn't powerful enough, this is where you really need to switch to a different iron. All right, so I've got a bigger iron here, and we're just gonna come in and try this again. You can see much easier this time. I'm not putting actual pressure on the board with my iron, so I'm gonna use low temperature hot air to melt the flux and clean it up so that we can use some fresh flux to wick. Not gonna go too crazy with cleaning here yet. Alright, so a little bit of fresh flux to wick this up. Again, tinning my iron a tiny bit before beginning wicking. And we're just gonna go slowly here. And as soon as you feel your wick is stuck like this, do not pull harder or push harder with your iron. Stop where you are, because this is an indication that your iron is not hot enough, or you're not using the right tip size, or you just need to use a bigger iron. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna switch from the C210 handle to the C245 handle, and I'm gonna use this similarly sized knife tip. Actually, it's a little bit bigger, but it's gonna have a lot more power behind it with this handle instead of the C210 handle. We're gonna do this again. I'm gonna apply a little bit more flux to the top of the wick, and I'm gonna gently grab the wick and just apply my iron. And you can see this is going significantly better here. So the larger iron had no problems transferring enough heat through the wick to the BGA pads. You honestly can't have enough flux when doing this. And as always, apply solder to your tip in between the times that you're wicking, because the wick will take all of the solder off of your iron too, which is going to minimize the heat transfer between the wick and the iron. So I've got my iron tinned again, and I'm gonna come in and do another pass. There we go. And just take your time with this. If you have to do a few passes, it's better than ripping pads off the board. The other thing I'll mention with wicking like this is cut tiny pieces of wick like this instead of using it off of the roll or that kind of thing, or using large pieces of wick, because it's going to disperse any of the heat that you apply with your iron through the entire length of the wick that you're using. So a smaller piece is going to help you wick significantly more without having heat transfer problems. The last thing we're going to want to do is inspect the pads, and you can see if you aren't careful enough, you can have some instances like this here. Now this is probably not enough to cause any issues, but I'm still going to fix this. What I'm referring to is this little scraped up area here. Some of the coating can sometimes come off of some of the traces in between the pads, and it can cause the solder balls on these pads to stick to each other, because solder is going to want to stick to this area here. The problem in this case is not the two pads touching, because they're actually the same point. The problem is the difference in height of these two balls when they stick to each other is going to make it so that they either don't make contact with the chip or don't make contact as well with the chip as the other balls on the board. All right, so I have some solder mask on this little BGA tool here, just like this. I'm gonna attempt to use my super small tweezers to transfer some of this right where we need it. All right, that's good. So we're gonna wanna spread this out a tiny bit so it cures properly and doesn't get in the way of the chip. So that's fine. I'm just gonna take the curing light. We're gonna set it to a minute. And we'll let that cure. All right, so after 1 minute, I'm just gonna come in, clean it up a little bit, and we'll cure it for 1 more minute. And then we have to scrape away the solder mask on the actual pads themselves. So I'll use my titanium tweezers to just very gently do circular motions above these pads that we actually want solder to adhere to. So that's perfect. and we'll do the same thing on the other one. We've successfully covered the middle of those two pads. So the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to take this out of the board holder, and I'm going to grab our preheater, and we're going to take the eMMC module off of here because we don't want this to get hot unnecessarily. And we're going to preheat the board. I'm going to set this to just like 120, and we just want the board to be a little bit warm so that it'll be easier to put the chip on. All right, so this is nice and preheated. And then I'm gonna put the board this way because my tweezers are gonna be easier to use from the right-hand side over here. Angles are everything. Okay, and I'm gonna dab a tiny bit of flux like that. And I'm just going to spread this around with a Q-tip like this. Just make sure to get flux on all the pads, but we don't want a huge pool of it because the chip will just float around. So this needs to go on with the dot in the top right from this orientation. And on these Max chips, the dot is just the little plus sign. Let me zoom in. That little plus symbol, that needs to match up with the orientation of this dot here. And then we want to straighten this thing out. You can kind of eyeball it. The spacing between the caps up here and here should be even, and then the corner should be directly above this. So we're just gonna slowly heat up the area without any tip on the hot air station, just like this. Right now I'm using about 20% airspeed at 225, just warming the top of the board, similar to how we warmed the bottom with the preheater. And when you're using the hot air like this, you wanna be as straight up and down with it as you possibly can. I have to kind of be under the microscope a little bit, so can't get perfectly straight up and down right now, but it's really helps with heat transfer. And just keep it moving. All right, now I'm gonna boost the temperature up to 280. The nice thing about the solder paste that we used is it melts at about 183 degrees Celsius, which is pretty low, which is nice. But we're gonna have to get up to about 350-ish on the hot air before we start to see the chip move into place. We're just slowly heating the chip and the board right now, so that when we do use higher temperature, which I'm gonna go up to 325 now, it'll more easily solder. I'm gonna boost the airspeed just a tad. Nothing too crazy. Higher airspeed will transfer more heat to the board, but it will also obviously blow things around if you're not careful. All right, I'm gonna go up to 350 now and do some slower movements over the chip. And you can see it sort of centered itself there. I'm gonna apply flux around the chip. Now, since it's already adhered to the board, I'm not worried about it going anywhere. So I'm gonna put my tip back on. We're gonna stay at about 350. Heat the area a bit more directly. You can see it just moved a tiny bit there, which is great. That means it is properly flowed onto the board, and we can let the board cool down. Definitely don't just like dump alcohol on this right away. Since the board and chip are warm, you don't want to shock it with cool alcohol. So just let it cool down for a little bit first, and then you can go in and clean. All right, so now that the board is cooled down, we can get this cleaned up. Awesome, so that chip is nicely on the board. And I'm just gonna go ahead and do the same thing for this chip here. You can see with this one, there's no diagram like there was on the other one, but there is this little arrow here. This points to where the plus sign is supposed to go in this case. And the nice part about this one is we have these two nice little points which indicate where the corners of the chip are supposed to line up. Also with this one, you have the speaker connector down here, which I'm just covering with some Kapton tape. They're surprisingly heat resistant, but you don't want to be melting that. So got that covered up. Cool, so that is nicely secured on there and the area is nice and clean. I think what I'm going to do is split this into 3 separate videos. The next part is going to be reballing and replacing these VRAM chips, because even though the process is similar to these chips, it can be a bit different working with larger chips like this versus these small power regulators. And then finally, we will take a look at what goes into trace repair on an actual chip like this, as well as on the board itself. So that'll be it for this one. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.